Story 1. The morning had begun like every other dew clinging to the iron fence. The faint echo of crows somewhere beyond the trees. The old chapel still casting long shadows even under a rising sun. George had worked the same cemetery grounds for 32 years. He knew every curve of the gravel paths, every crack on the brick walls, every stone that had ever been placed by human hand. That's why, when he turned the corner past Section C and saw a fifth headstone where there had always been 4, he stopped cold. The new stone stood at the center of a perfect circle formed by 4 others Clemens, Haworth, Lane, and Doyle, families local to the area, their inscriptions familiar, sometimes even visited by their descendants on Memorial Sundays. But this 5th slab hadn't been there yesterday. George would have noticed. He always did. His boots crunched closer. The grass around the base was untouched, the soil undisturbed, the edges of the stone clean and sharp like it had been lowered by invisible hands in the dead of night. There were no signs of digging, no tire marks from the backhoe, no records in the burial logs, and no name chiseled into the face of the granite. It was simply there, silent, immaculate, and impossibly aligned at the very heart of that familial square. He crouched to touch it, cold even in the morning warmth, older than it looked. The surface had the grainy texture of weathered stone, but without a single chip or scratch. There was a hum too not audible, but felt, like standing too close to a transformer, only deeper, more hollow, as if the stone were pulling sound inward. George stood up uneasily and circled the formation. Everything else was just as it had been. The same overgrown hedge leaning in from the east, the same patch of moss on Doyle's grave, the same bronze flower holder, empty as always, beside Clemens' marker. He went back to the records room after his shift. Nothing had been logged. No funeral home delivery. No municipal work order. He even called Raymond, the only other groundskeeper with a key to the northern tool shed. "Haven't touched a thing near Section C," Ray had said, half asleep and annoyed. "What the hell are you doing out there at sunrise?" The next morning, the stone was still there, still blank, still untouched. George placed a small twig on its top before starting his rounds, just to be sure it wasn't some bizarre prank. When he returned, the twig was gone. There was no wind that day. And then something stranger happened. When he tried to read the names on the 4 surrounding graves, he struggled. Letters blurred in his mind, like wet ink. Lane's dates escaped him. Haworth's epitaph was hazy. He blamed his age, the sun in his eyes, the glare off the marble. But even under shade, even kneeling close, he couldn't quite make them out. It was like trying to remember a dream halfway through waking up. That evening, George brought a flashlight and a notepad, intending to document everything. But when he flipped to the fresh page to begin writing the names around the new headstone, he realized he couldn't remember a single one. Not without checking the old maps. Not without forcing the names back into existence. Something about the 5th stone was disrupting more than the pattern of the graves. It was challenging the permanence of memory itself. And yet, he didn't report it. Not yet. He only stood there in silence, long after dark had settled over the cemetery, eyes fixed on that nameless monolith, feeling something ancient and deliberate radiating from its core. Something patient. Something waiting. It was the woman with the walking stick who first mentioned it out loud. She came every other Thursday to visit her sister's grave, Margaret Lane, born 1932, past 2011, 2nd stone from the left in that old familiar circle. But this time, she looked puzzled, then distressed, then quietly angry. "You moved the stone," she muttered. "You polished it too much. I can't read her name." George approached, expecting to offer comfort or explanation, but as he stood beside her, he too couldn't make out the letters. The engraving, once deep and sharp, now looked like the surface of water, in motion shimmering impressions of words that resisted being fixed in the mind. By the end of that week, 3 more visitors made similar remarks. Some said the names looked melted. Others claimed the marble had gone smooth. One woman even brought a photograph she'd taken years ago with her father's headstone in frame. She held it up next to the real stone and asked, with shaking hands, why the carving was gone. George examined it. The photo clearly showed Edgar Clemens, 1918 to 1995. But the stone now was just a blank gray monolith beside the new arrival. No dates, no name, no trace of Edgar at all. The cemetery record still listed all 4 graves. Their positions were clear on the map, their information intact in both paper and digital format. But standing out there, among the stones themselves, something was eroding presence, not just names. People began photographing the graves obsessively, hoping to catch the writing before it faded. But the pictures always came back wrong, overexposed, smeared, or simply blank, as if the lens couldn't fix its gaze on what was no longer meant to be remembered. George marked the 4 stones with chalk, tracing outlines where letters used to be. By morning, the chalk was gone, not washed away, gone. The surfaces beneath were slightly darker, like they'd been burned from the inside. He touched one of them with his bare hand and recoiled. It was freezing, even under the sun. His skin tingled for hours afterward, as if he'd brushed against something far older than stone. He brought it up to the church's grounds committee in a routine meeting. They chuckled at first, assuming he meant vandalism. But when he showed the photographs, one of the board members frowned and quietly excused herself. She returned minutes later with an old visitor log from the 90s. The names Clemens, Lane, Howarth, Doyle clearly listed. But now, her voice faltered. I don't remember any of these people, and I've been on the board for 30 years. That was when George began checking every morning, notebook in hand. He returned again and again to the circle, trying to reaffirm what used to be there. But each time, he had to remind himself harder. Each time, the silence around the new stone deepened. Visitors would approach, stand confused, and turn away without knowing why. He saw it in their faces, not fear, but absence, an inability to attach meaning to what should have been sacred. One late afternoon, a young boy wandered in with his father. As they passed near the circle, the boy pointed to the new stone and whispered, "That one's still hungry." His father didn't hear, but George did, and for the first time, he didn't question the words. He just stood there, notebook clutched tightly, watching as the boy kept walking, and the names behind him faded a little more. George maintained his routine visits to that forgotten corner of the cemetery, now always accompanied by his old notebook and a small pocket flashlight, as if he needed to prove to himself, every single day, that the names had once existed. But even the act of recording began to feel pointless. Letters he had written by hand in the morning would appear smudged by night. Dates he had checked dozens of times began to float in his memory, as if they belonged to someone who had never existed. In a desperate attempt to preserve what was left, he decided to consult the old parish ledger, the one he had inherited from the last gravedigger before him, a man named Victor Finch, who had died in 2006 or at least. That's what his signature claimed on the final pages. The book rested in a drawer in the chapel, wrapped in a dark cloth George had never replaced. The first pages were fragile, yellowed, but intact. However, when he reached the section that corresponded to the 4 erased graves Clemens, Lane, Howarth, Doyle, he felt a chill. Edgar Clemens's page felt thinner, as if someone had scraped the fibers from within the paper itself. When he turned it, Margaret Lane's page was already partially crumbling, releasing tiny flakes that floated in the air like ashes. He ran his finger along the lower edge, and the birth date dissolved at the slightest touch, as if it had never been printed. He tried to photograph the pages before it was too late, but just like the tombstones, the images came out distorted, smudged, or simply blank. Some were black, as if the lens had been covered by something dense and motionless. Gripped by an irrational urgency, George began to hand copy every remaining page, even those that didn't seem threatened. But as he wrote, the names slipped from his mind. Letters he had known since childhood now looked wrong. At times, without realizing, he would swap names, confuse ages, and stare at the scribbles as if they belonged to another language. In the margin of Howarth's nearly vanished page, he noticed something written in pencil in a trembling hand. She erases the forgotten first, then those who remember. Just below it, barely visible, another line: do not write your name near hers. George flipped forward and saw that the next page, where the central gravestone would be, the new one, the intruder, was nothing but a blank space. No name, no date, nothing. But the paper was warm to the touch, and it felt damp. That night, he dreamed of the book. But in the dream, the pages were alive, pulsing, breathing, with thin veins forming between the lines. When he woke up, he ran back to the chapel. He found the book closed, but thinner. He grabbed a ruler. 8 pages were missing, and there were no tears. No sign anyone had ripped them out, as if they had been consumed from the inside out. Outside, in the circle of gravestones, a 5th stone now seemed to be losing its edges. It wasn't vanishing completely, just beginning to fade from collective memory. He had to double-check the name in the records. He was almost certain it was where Victor Finch had been laid to rest. But now, even his name felt wrong. George no longer knew if the nights were growing longer, or if it was simply that he lingered too long among the graves. The hours slipped by, like the moss now creeping beneath his feet, silent and green in corners of the cemetery that had once been dry. There was something around the new headstone that warped time and memory, as if the place had become a spiral. Even the rare visitors' sons, wives, brothers of the buried, seemed to leave slower, quieter, as if they had forgotten why they came, all except for one woman. Tall, thin, with skin like aged parchment and hair tied tightly in a bun. She came holding flowers, but her eyes carried a firmness absent in the others. She walked directly to the grave of Howard Doyle, one of the first names to vanish. George watched from a distance, curious to see if she too would forget the name carved into the stone. But she knelt down, laid the flowers, and didn't hesitate. She stared at the stone as if the name were still there, as if she could see beyond the erasure. When she rose, her eyes met George's. He offered a brief nod. She didn't respond. She walked straight to him, and in a steady voice said, "He's trying to call me, but I won't go." George didn't understand. "Who's calling you?" he asked. The woman slowly turned her head to face the new headstone at the center of the circle, and replied, "The one who has no name yet." Then, without warning, her expression shifted. It became distant, lost, as if something inside her mind had slipped. "My husband. He told me in a dream." He whispered, "George, don't let her take you. Let me be the last." His name had been erased from his stone just 2 days earlier. She feeds on the forgotten, but if she erases someone still remembered, she grows, expands the circle. The field widens, and the names are lost forever. She gripped George's arm tightly. "You must stop it, or she will erase all of us." Before he could ask anything else, she let go and began walking away. But her steps faltered. She stopped, touched the side of her head, like someone who no longer knows where they are, looked around, then turned to George with confused eyes, as if seeing him for the first time. "I'm sorry. Do I know you?" she asked. In her lap, the flowers had slipped from her grasp. Now they rested at her feet, wilted, as if they had aged in mere minutes. George remained still, his wrist still feeling the pressure of her fingers. After she left, he returned to the parish ledger. He needed to check Howard Doyle's page one more time. But where once there had been crumbling paper, there was now only a smooth edge, as if no entry had ever existed. Nothing. No trace that anyone by that name had ever been buried. The next morning, he went to the circle. Doyle's headstone was completely gone. In its place, only smooth grass and a slight depression in the earth. But George knew, because now, the next stone in the circle had begun to blur. Margaret Lane, and just beyond her, the faint outline of a new headstone was already taking shape. George knew he was only delaying the inevitable. The nights had begun to leave him restless. It wasn't physical exhaustion, nor fear. It was as if the very logic surrounding the new headstone was crumbling, an invisible fracture that widened with every forgotten name. He felt it as he looked over the records. The ink was vanishing. Printed photos lost their faces. The names on the cemetery maps were disappearing like lines drawn in sand. But a certainty was growing in his chest, a quiet conviction that the only way to stop the erasure was to face head on what he had only circled around until now. It was on a windless early morning that he finally decided to walk to the center of the circle, alone with a flashlight in hand and the parish ledger under his arm. The new stone remained where it always had, clean, untouched, solid. But for the first time, something had been carved into it. George knelt before the grave. The flashlight flickered. Its beam seemed to hesitate as it touched the surface. The letters were there, but they weren't normal. They were too deep, glowing faintly with a damp shimmer, as if the stone itself bled words. He read slowly. A name, simple, direct, and absolutely unknown. He had never seen it, never heard it. It appeared in no obituary, no record, not even in the county archives. The name felt misplaced, as if it had been brought from somewhere that shouldn't exist. George felt something strange as he pronounced the sequence of letters, a pressure in his ears, as if a voice was speaking with him from inside. That same night, back in the administration office, he decided to consult his own records. He wanted to log the name, enter it into the system, document what he'd seen. But when he tried to write it, his hand failed. The pen slipped. The ink spilled. He wiped it, tried to type instead. The keyboard froze. The files wouldn't open. And then, while searching for his signature in older documents, George noticed it was gone. His own reports, submitted over the past 30 years, now ended in blank spaces, as if he had never signed anything. He checked the employee archive, looked for his file. Missing. His name had vanished from the duty schedule, from payroll, from the original contract. George rushed to the bathroom mirror, looked at his badge. The name was there, but when he blinked, the reflection showed something different. The nameplate was blank. He felt panic swell like steam, filling his bones. He returned to the parish ledger, searched its corners, margins, appendices. Finally, he found a section where his name had been written dozens of times as a witness. Now, all the lines were crossed out, not by pen, but as if the memory of the ink itself had been torn away. In the silence of the early morning, with the archives vanishing before his eyes, he understood. That headstone didn't belong to anyone, because it belonged to everyone. And now, it was him who was being consumed. His name, his presence, his signature upon the world were being pulled inward into that core. There would be no memory left, only blank space. Maybe that's what it did, not killing bodies, but killing history. The proof, the trace. George closed the book, and for the first time in 40 years, he could no longer recall his own last name. Story 2. He walked in just after 5:30, when the sun was casting long amber streaks across the floor of the reception hall. The front door creaked louder than usual, but the man who entered moved with an unsettling stillness, like someone who had rehearsed this visit 1,000 times in his head. He wore a dark brown overcoat, buttoned all the way up despite the heat, and carried a weathered leather briefcase in one hand. His hair was silvery white, neatly parted to the side, and his eyes gray, unreadable, didn't blink much. When he reached the front desk, he spoke softly, but with the clarity of someone who didn't want to be misunderstood. He said he wanted to make arrangements for himself. Full service, no shortcuts. His tone wasn't morbid or fearful. It was practical, almost serene. The clerk, used to families fumbling through tears or ignoring costs entirely, found the man's calmness odd, but not alarming. Not yet. They sat in the small office near the flower room. The man specified a closed casket dark walnut with brass handles. He chose lily, no roses. Sighed he preferred a piano instrumental of Clair de Lune, but didn't want any hymns. His ceremony was to be short, held indoors, no eulogies. People don't really know what to say, he added, almost to himself. When asked for details, he listed a name, Charles D. Halberg, and spelled it twice. The clerk entered it into the system. Nothing. He searched again with only the surname. Still nothing. No prior death record. No social number. No insurance trace. No local medical history. Are you new to the area? The clerk asked, blinking at the empty fields on his screen. Oh, I've always been around, the man said, smiling with something behind the smile that didn't feel like amusement. Trying not to sound rude, the clerk gently explained that they needed a valid ID to process any prepaid services. Charles D. Halberg placed the briefcase on the desk and opened it. Inside were carefully counted bills crisp, stacked, banded. No ID, just the money and a folded form already filled out. You'll find everything in order, he said, tapping the page once. The clerk hesitated, glancing again at the screen that refused to recognize the name. Sir, it's just a formality, but we'll need a reference. A relative, perhaps? The man stood up, slowly, as though rehearsing his last rise from a chair. There won't be any visitors, he said. It'll be a quiet service. And besides, he paused, looking at the ticking clock on the wall. After tomorrow, it won't really matter, will it? He closed the briefcase with a soft click, gave a slight nod, and walked out of the office without looking back. The clerk called after him, Sir? Mr. Halberg? But the man didn't respond. He exited through the hallway that led toward the side entrance by the chapel, not the main doors. When the clerk returned to the desk, the form was still there, filled out in clean, immaculate handwriting. At the bottom, the signature was already in place. The pen on the desk hadn't been used. The air in the room felt heavier, like someone had forgotten to leave. And when the clerk glanced at the date of service requested, 2 days from now, it matched the slot they hadn't yet published on the calendar, one that no one was supposed to know existed. By morning, the paperwork from the night before had become an object of fixation. The funeral director, who had not been present during the visit, found the form left on the desk. He held it in his hands, like something suspiciously old, though the page was clean and the ink looked fresh. What struck him wasn't the content, but the sensation he got while holding it like static in his fingers, or the hum of a refrigerator that wasn't running. The handwriting, oddly elegant and mechanical, had a symmetry that didn't feel human. And the signature at the bottom, Charles D. Halberg, was too perfect, too still, as if the name had always existed on the page. But the pen had no ink residue, and no pressure marks were found on the paper. The director placed the form into the archive cabinet and retrieved the envelope with the payment cash, stacked with strange uniformity, all in bills that had been phased out decades ago. They weren't counterfeit, just old, real enough to deposit, untraceable enough to bother him. But even more unsettling was the timestamp on the printed confirmation slip generated by the in-house phone system. It claimed the transaction had been created 3 days prior to the man's visit. No one remembered printing it. No paper was missing, no record of edits. But there it was, filed with a time and date that didn't align with any logged keystroke. Curiosity turning into discomfort, the director checked the funeral planning software's activity log. The entry for Halberg's service had been manually added, apparently, in the early hours of the morning on a date no staff had worked. The system's access code belonged to an employee who had died 5 years earlier. The login hadn't been used since their passing. IT support suggested a glitch, perhaps a server echo from an old backup, but the director wasn't convinced. He asked around. None of the attendants remembered seeing the man leave. The main door had been closed since just after he entered, but the internal cameras mounted for liability, not security, should have caught him walking out. They checked the footage. The man could be seen entering, walking calmly, moving down the hallway toward the chapel. But then, nothing. No exit. No visual of him leaving through the front side or rear doors. One moment he was there, the next he was gone, as if the hallway itself had swallowed him. They replayed it 4 times. Same result. Just static on the last 2 seconds before he vanished, like the film reel had skipped forward, cutting something out. The director returned to the office and stared at the document again. The box for next of kin was blank. The field for service details was filled in meticulously. Date, time, flowers, music, burial location. All correct. 2 correct. And at the bottom, beneath the signature that no pen had touched, a final note had been scribbled in smaller text, so faint it was nearly missed. It said, "Thank you for keeping the appointment." The director didn't know what unsettled him more, that someone had planned their own funeral in such disturbing detail, or that someone had planned it without ever existing at all. By the afternoon of that same day, unease had begun to creep into the funeral staff, like dampness under a closed door. The director and his assistant, a younger man named Callum, who had handled the initial intake of Mr. Halberg, decided to make a courtesy visit, if only to ease their minds. The address listed on the form pointed to a modest residential neighborhood 20 minutes north, a cul-de-sac with tidy porches and wind chimes that moved despite the still air. They knocked on the door numbered 38 twice, then 3 times. No one answered. A neighbor watering her plants across the street tilted her head when asked about the man. She'd lived there 26 years. Never seen a Charles D. Halberg. Never heard the name. That house, she said, had been vacant for over a year. Back at the funeral home, they tried the listed phone number. A dead tone. No voicemail. Callum, now pale, suggested reviewing the security footage again. Maybe he had simply left through the back without being noticed. But the rear exit remained locked that evening. It required a staff keycard to open, and no such record had been logged. They watched again. The man entered. He turned into the left hallway toward the chapel's consultation room, but he never emerged. No shadow, no reflection in the glass. He didn't pass through any other visible angle. The camera in the corridor itself, ironically installed the year prior, due to a slip-and-fall incident, showed exactly nothing. It froze at the precise moment he should have walked past. Just a frame of empty hallway. Then 2 minutes later, the image resumed, but the room was empty, clean, undisturbed. Callum looked increasingly uncomfortable. "That's not possible," he whispered, tapping the time stump. I watched him go in. I offered him coffee. He smiled. He had a mole right here. He gestured to his cheek, and I shook his hand. He was cold. The director didn't respond. He was already opening the consultation room door. The room was as it should be, windowless, with a small table, 2 chairs, and a credenza with floral brochures. But one chair was slightly pulled back. A faint impression remained in the seat's cushion, still pressed down, as if someone had just stood up. On the desk, a coaster was damp, but there was no mug, no coffee machine in use, no explanation. By the time night fell, they'd exhausted every attempt to trace him. No birth record, no social security entry, no prior funeral inquiries under that name. When Callum, out of nervous curiosity, typed Charles D. Halberg into the statewide obituary search, the page returned a result, just one, published 5 years ago. Same name, same face, same signature attached in a PDF, a listed time of death, January 18th, 2018. Exact match. The director stared at the screen, but he was just here. And Callum, breathing shallow now, looked back at the empty chair in the consultation room and murmured, "Then, what did we shake hands with?" 2 days passed under an oppressive stillness. No new clients, no deliveries, just the quiet anticipation of the funeral no one could fully explain. When the truck from the casket supplier pulled into the lot that morning, the director and Callum both stepped out to greet it, if only to confirm some small piece of this arrangement was real. The delivery men, unaware of any prior unease, lowered the polished oak coffin with its brass fittings and custom lining, the exact specifications chosen by Mr. Halberg, The invoice was clipped and stamped. Paid in full. No discrepancies. No delay. The casket was wheeled into the preparation room, its surface gleaming under the flickering overhead light. It should have been empty. That's what they both told themselves as the director undid the latches with slow, deliberate fingers. But the second the lid lifted, the smell hit them, not decay, but the faint chemical trace of formaldehyde, recent and unmistakable. And inside, nestled in linen folds as if laid there moments before, was the man himself. Callum's legs buckled slightly. The director stepped back in silence. It was Mr. Halberg. Same crisp navy suit, same pressed white collar, same black leather shoes he had walked in with. His face serene, hands crossed, a faint smile still resting on his lips, exactly as it had when he first entered the chapel 2 days earlier. There was no mistake. Even the folder he had carried, the brown leather one with the tarnished brass clasp, rested beside his legs inside the coffin. But there was something else. Pressed flat against his chest was a folded certificate, not the type issued by the county, but one that looked older, hand-typed, yellowed. A death certificate, yes, but with a date neither of them could explain. January 18th, 2018. Signed, stamped, filed. Callum whispered, "That's the same document. The one from the obituary archive." The director looked down again. It's impossible. He was alive. He walked in here. We talked. He ordered this. But even as he said it, he noticed something colder than doubt tightening in his chest. Something older. Something unspoken. He reached into the casket and lifted the death certificate. A second sheet lay underneath. Not paper, but vellum thin, translucent, hand-lettered. A list. Dozens of names. Dates beside them. Some crossed out, others circled. At the bottom, the final line had just one word: accepted. The casket lid closed with a sound far softer than it should have made. That afternoon, the chapel held the viewing with no visitors. No family. No obituary flowers. No priest. Just the two of them, watching, waiting. And when Callum asked who would give the final prayer, the director only said, "No one." He paid for silence. And the chapel remained silent until the next morning, when the bell above the chapel door rang again, and another man walked in, smiling, holding a brown leather folder. The night before the scheduled burial, the chapel felt heavier than usual. Not just quiet, but dense. The kind of silence that sinks into the skin. Callum stayed late to finish paperwork. He couldn't bring himself to understand, flipping through the service logs and inventory sheets, trying to convince himself that it all made sense on paper, even if it didn't in his mind. The man had paid. The casket had arrived. The body was where it was supposed to be. And yet, everything about it was wrong. At some point, the old chapel speakers above the altar, long unused, powered off years ago, when the sound system was gutted, crackled faintly, so faint it almost passed for static. He paused, eyes on the ceiling. Then it came again. Not static, a whisper. The voice was dry, low, deliberate like breath, forced through cracked lips. It said only, "Thank you for accepting." The air went still again. But then came another line, stretched across time itself. "Please, don't try to remember me." Callum froze. His skin felt cold, his spine rigid. He scrambled up the old balcony stairs to check the equipment, but there was no power, no wires connected to anything. The system wasn't even functional, just a box of rusted circuits and dust. Still, the voice had been real. He had heard it, alone, echoing through walls that were never meant to speak again. The next morning, the body was buried quietly under a pale morning sky. No guests, no mourners, just two gravediggers and the director, hands clasped at his back. When the earth finally settled over the box, Callum felt a strange emptiness press into him. Not grief, not loss, just vacancy, like something had been erased. Back inside, he opened the chapel registry to finalize the entry. He flipped to the previous day's log, trying to write the man's name in the column, but his pen hesitated. something was missing. The name, the handwriting, the memory. A man's face blurred in his mind like fog on glass. He tried to describe the features to himself. Gray hair. Brown? Thin? Heavy? Nothing stayed. Even the footage from the entry camera he tried to scrub back to the moment the man arrived showed only the chapel door opening on its own. No shadow, no figure, no folder. He ran back to the drawer where the original form had been filed, the one they'd both seen, signed, verified. But it wasn't there. In its place was a blank piece of paper, not erased empty, like it had never been used at all. The director came in behind him. Who was buried this morning? Callum asked, panic creeping into his voice. The director looked puzzled. What do you mean? We didn't have any burials today. None scheduled until Friday. But Callum tried to explain, but the words stalled. His throat tightened. He looked down at his hand and saw the funeral journal he'd carried for months open to a blank page. The ink on previous entries had faded, like water pulling memories from paper. He ran to the graveyard, to the plot where they'd laid him. No fresh earth, no marker. Just flat ground, smooth, untouched, as if no one had ever been buried there. Only a breeze remained, and in it, something barely audible like wind. Or maybe a whisper. Please, forget me. And somehow, Callan knew. He already had. Story 3. He'd walked those gravel paths every morning for the past 19 years. Keys jangling softly against his hip, boots moist with dew, always before the town even stirred. But that night, no. That morning it wasn't the gravel that caught his attention, or the wind brushing the cedar trees along the chapel walls. It was the bell, 3 distinct tolls. Hollow, cold, and slow. The kind of sound that doesn't echo through air, but through bone. Harold Whitmer stopped halfway through pouring stale coffee into his chipped thermos, the same one he used every night at 4 a.m. The bell hadn't rung since the flood of '94, when the chapel had partially collapsed, and the entire bell mechanism was declared unsafe and disconnected. Even before that, it was only used for formal ceremonies, and only rung by hand. There was no wind, no funeral scheduled, and no living soul near enough to pull that cord. And yet, it rang. 4:12 a.m. He checked his watch. 3 times, like a toll of warning or welcome. He stared out the small window above the sink, angled just right to see the dark silhouette of the chapel tower in the moonlight. Still, silent again. As if it hadn't happened. But it had. He heard it with the same certainty that he knew the names of every person buried on those grounds. At 6:40 a.m., the sheriff's voice came through the crackling phone line in the office. Old Barry Feller had died in his recliner, peaceful, no sign of struggle, no sign of illness, no record of any medical condition, just gone, like a switch had been flipped. Harold didn't connect the dots that first morning. Death was part of his routine, expected. It wasn't until the second time, 2 weeks later, that the sound returned. 3 tolls, again at 4:12. No storm, no wind, just the deep, sonorous groan of the bell, like something remembering it still existed. And by 7 a.m., another call, another unexplained passing, different neighborhood, different kind of person, but the same stillness in the report. Harold didn't say anything then either. Didn't want to seem like he was losing his grip. But on the 3rd morning after the 3rd toll, he stood outside in the gravel, staring up at the chapel tower, half daring it to ring again. The air was dry, dead still, and yet the bell swayed, not visibly, not with any real motion, but enough that he felt it deep in his spine, like the sensation you get before a storm, before thunder, before something old and wrong makes itself known. The next day, there was another death. No one thought to connect them. No one but Harold. That night, he didn't sleep. He waited, alone in the chapel, lights off, clock ticking so loud it sounded like breathing. When it came, those 3 tolls, at 4:12, he felt a pressure behind his eyes, a pulse not of sound, but of recognition. He didn't know how he knew. He just did. Something had started. and it was keeping track. Harold never kept diaries, never trusted paper more than his own memory, but after the 5th death, he started writing things down. Not because he was afraid he'd forget, but because he wanted something left behind in case he was right. A yellowed legal pad hidden behind the chapel's oil heater became his ledger. Names, dates, and a single column marked time heard. Every entry matched. 4:12 a.m., 3 tolls. The deaths followed like clockwork, not just in timing, but in silence. No violence, no struggle, just people gently exiting their lives as if called away. A postman found in his truck, engine still running. A young woman collapsed by her sink, coffee mug still steaming. A retired teacher, his hand still holding the remote. No illness, no warning. Harold noted them all, circling the ones that lived closest to the cemetery. The proximity felt deliberate. The sound didn't ring out across town. It stayed trapped between the chapel walls. Yet somehow, those named in silence heard it too, even if only in their final moment. He tried bringing it up at the diner once, easing the pattern into casual conversation. "You ever notice how the bell's been tolling again?" He asked Lou at the counter. "Bell?" Lou squinted. "I thought you said it was broken." "It is," Harold muttered. "But it's been ringing." Lou just chuckled and poured coffee. "You're hearing ghosts again." That's when Harold realized no one else had heard it. Not the deputies who patrolled the area. Not the priest who came every 3rd Sunday. Not even Martha, who sometimes cleaned the chapel pews in the early morning. Only Harold and the dead. After the 7th name was written in his notebook, Harold began to test things. He stayed outside the chapel all night with a recorder. He installed a motion camera at the bell tower. He even tried setting up a vibration sensor on the old wooden cord. Nothing. The audio files caught only ambient wind. The camera showed still shadows and blinking lights, but never movement. No vibration was logged, yet the bell tolled. Always 3 times. Always at 4:12. And the next morning, always a new name in the obituary column. Just like ink dried on a prophecy. He started watching the townspeople differently. Not as neighbors, but as entries in a list only he could see forming. Some mornings he'd wake up drenched in sweat, convinced he'd missed it, that the bell had tolled and he hadn't heard. But it never skipped. Not once. On the 23rd morning, when the bell rang out and he already knew whose name would follow, he sat at his desk in the dim chapel office and whispered to the empty walls, "Why me?" The walls answered with silence. The kind that wraps around your ribs and stays there. He was starting to wonder if it wasn't a warning, but an invitation. It was a Thursday. The air was dry, unusually warm for that time of year, and Harold had already lit the incense in the chapel, not because he believed in anything sacred, but because the scent of damp wood and rotting hymn books had started crawling into his skin. He sat by the window facing the bell tower, notebook open, pen resting in his palm like a weight heavier than it should be. Every night had followed the same rhythm. He'd wait. The clock would bleed into 4:12, and the bell would call. But this time the silence felt wrong. Not peaceful, not expectant wrong. He watched the seconds pass on his old wristwatch, the soft tick barely audible beneath the hum of the heater. When the moment came, he stood, heart ready for that familiar sound. A noise that had become so routine and now had shape in his mind. But nothing came. No echo, no chime, no ripple through the chapel air. He stood longer than usual, as if willing the silence to break itself, like a child waiting for thunder after lightning. Still nothing, just the hollow ache of nothing. He wrote "no toll" in his ledger, underlined it twice, then circled the space where a name would go the next morning. There was none. He stared at that blank line for hours, until sleep blurred the ink and the oil lamp guttered out. At dawn, the door creaked open behind him. A woman stood in the aisle, pale, hair tangled, eyes wide with something not quite fear. She said her name was Rosalie, and she had dreamed of the chapel the night before of the bell ringing, and her own name whispered inside it. But when she awoke and ran here, she found silence. "It was supposed to be me," she said, voice thin as tissue. "I felt it." Harold asked where she lived. Her address was 2 blocks from the cemetery wall, too close. He offered her water, and she shook her head. "No," she whispered. "I just wanted to see if the bell forgave me." And she left, vanishing between the marble rows like fog, pulled by something deeper. That day, for the first time in 3 months, no death was reported in town. No heart failure. No freak accident. Nothing. The hospital confirmed a blank sheet for admissions. The obituaries were empty. The funeral home received no calls. Harold sat with that reality like a stone in his chest. The bell had skipped, and someone had survived. But it wasn't a mistake, it was withheld. The system, the force behind that toll, had decided not to take. Why? The question coiled around Harold's mind like a vine. Maybe it wasn't a schedule. Maybe it was a hunger. And last night, it had simply changed its mind, or worse, delayed for something it wanted more. He had avoided climbing that tower for years. It wasn't fear of heights, nor superstition. It was something less tangible, something that pressed gently against his ribs when he stood near the chapel wall and looked up, as if the tower wasn't part of the same building, as if it had been bolted onto the church, like a parasite, pretending to be part of the structure. But after Rosalie and the silent night, Harold couldn't keep away. He brought no flashlight, just a lantern, the kind with flickering yellow light that threw shadows like fingers reaching upward. Each step on the narrow staircase groaned, not from age, but from reluctance, like the very wood resisted his ascent. At the top, he expected to find nothing. Maybe dust, maybe nests. The bell, massive and unmoving, hung from rusted iron that didn't so much creak as breathe. And yet, as he stepped into the small wooden platform beneath it, a warmth passed through him. Not heat, but a presence. The kind of stillness that makes a man feel watched, not with eyes, but with memory. He reached out and touched the rim of the bell. Metal, cold, rough. But when his skin met the bronze, sound didn't rise, it dropped, straight into his mind, not through his ears. There was no air vibration, no echo, just a voice, clear and slow, inside him. One word, a name, Douglas. He stumbled back, almost slipped. The voice faded instantly, like the final line of a prayer left unsaid. He scrambled down the stairs and checked every record in the funeral home's cabinet, every recent obituary, every citizen in town. No Douglas, no recent deaths, no expected ones. But 2 days later, the local paper printed a 1-column piece about a hiker found dead on the ridge trail just past the cemetery woods. His name was Douglas T. Mercer. No signs of violence. No obvious cause. Just ... stillness. Like he'd sat down to rest and never got back up. Harold didn't tell anyone, not even the police, when they came by to ask if he'd seen anything suspicious around the property. Because what could he say? That a dead piece of metal had whispered the man's name into his thoughts 2 days before his heart stopped? That the tower chose? That the bell was ringing not for the dead, but for the soon-to-be? He kept it all in his notebook, the ink now more frantic than neat, because what haunted him most wasn't that the bell had spoken, but that it had spoken before. The deaths weren't coincidences. They weren't forecasts. They were design, chosen. And if the bell could choose Douglas, if it could name Rosalie and change its mind, then someday it might not whisper at all. It might scream. He began to sleep less, not because of nightmares, but because of expectation. Harold had become a man who listened to silence more carefully than to sound. He no longer closed the curtains at night. He wanted to see the sky when it turned from black to that fragile gray before dawn. He wanted to be awake if the bell rang again. And on the 29th morning, since he'd heard the name Douglas inside the tower, the bell rang again. Not 3 times, 4. 4 exact strikes, evenly spaced, with a cold clarity that no wind could cause. And then, something new. A sound not carried by bronze or wind, but by something deeper. Beneath the 4th toll, Layered just barely within its dying vibration was a voice, a whisper, not shouted, not chanted, just spoken, as if someone had leaned close to his ear and sighed his name. Harold. It didn't echo. It didn't vanish. It settled inside him. He stood still in the hallway between the crematory office and the chapel proper, the pen in his hand trembling slightly above the registry page. For a moment, he considered pretending he hadn't heard, but the damage was already done. It wasn't about believing anymore. It had always been about timing. The next morning, nothing happened in the town. No ambulances, no accidents, no obituaries, no sudden hospital visits. For the first time in months, Harold saw a clean day on the board, where he marked each bell toll and its consequence. But something had still changed. His name now appeared on a form he didn't remember filling. A burial pre-registration with his full details, typed with perfect alignment, placed in the center of his desk, beneath the daily folder. The cemetery records also showed something he hadn't entered. A plot number, Section G, Lot 12. His own handwriting. He knew it, but not the moment it had been written. When he went out to the grounds that afternoon, his steps guided by instinct more than intention, he found the spot. No grave was dug yet. No marker stood, but the soil looked pressed, the grass around it strangely vibrant. And when he kneeled, because something in him needed to feel the ground, he heard it again. Not a voice, a breath, beneath, as if someone or something was already lying there, exhaling gently through the dirt. He walked back to the chapel in silence, passing co-workers, nodding faintly, but not speaking. That night, he sat in the chapel alone. The lights were off. The bell tower loomed above him, like a mouth that had already whispered its truth. He placed his keys on the front pew, folded his jacket over the armrest, and waited. He knew now that the bell didn't warn. It invited, it named, it summoned. And he, like the others before, had answered not by dying, but by knowing. And once you knew, you were already part of the silence that followed the fourth toll. Story 4. The rain hadn't let up for hours. A slow, steady curtain of water had soaked the grass, the stone paths, and the wooden steps of the chapel. And yet the cemetery still breathed in silence. It was just past 2 a.m. when the groundskeeper Thomas made his way toward the northern slope, lantern in hand, boots sinking slightly into the soft earth. His routine rounds rarely yielded anything but quiet rustlings or the faint shimmer of deer eyes caught in the dark. But that night, as he reached the old section where most graves hadn't seen visitors in years, something stopped him cold. Lot 39, a grave he'd closed himself less than 24 hours earlier. He remembered the funeral, a small one. A local kid named Eric Bell, only 22, talented guitarist, died in a car crash. No scandal, no family dispute. The burial had been normal, clean, with a modest dark-stained casket and a temporary nameplate. But now, that same casket sat above ground again, resting directly over the recently packed soil. No dirt clung to the polished surface. No scratches, no water damage. It looked untouched, dry even, as though it had never been lowered at all. Thomas stepped closer, flashlight trembling slightly. There were no signs of digging, no displaced earth, no shovel marks, no dragging trails. The grass around the grave was flattened, just as he left it, compressed only by his own feet from the previous day. He circled the coffin once, then twice, still sealed, the metal clasps unbroken. The small silver tag from the funeral home still wired to the handle, bearing the same initials. E.B. His breath clouded in front of him, mixing with the mist. He didn't open it. Not then. He simply placed a tarp over it and went back to the chapel, soaked to the bone, convinced he'd made a mistake, that maybe he'd misunderstood. Maybe he'd buried it somewhere else. But when he checked the map again, the tag, the death record, everything aligned. The paperwork was clear. The burial was in Lot 39, and Thomas had been the one who filled it in, alone. Slowly, a pressure began to settle behind his eyes. Not quite pain, but a heavy insistence, like a memory refusing to surface. He rubbed his temples, stared at the printed name again. Eric Bell. There was no doubt. It was the same casket, the same placement, the same impossible return. The following morning brought no clarity, only thicker fog and a deepening unease. Thomas had barely slept. The image of the casket, pristine and still resting above the grave, burned behind his eyelids like an imprint. After his coffee turned cold in his hand and the silence inside the chapel office became unbearable, he unlocked the archive drawer. The cemetery's burial records stretched back to 1924, yellowing ledgers filled with meticulous handwriting from caretakers long gone. He pulled the volumes for Lot 39, lining them up one by one on the table. The first entry dated back to 1943. A soldier returned from overseas. According to the record, he'd been buried and then relocated upon request of family. No further detail. Then another in 1957, marked Grave Unstable, moved to Lot 17. In 1968, a local woman named Miriam Price. Her burial lasted less than a week. The note read, temporary transfer, final arrangements pending. There was never a final location listed. It was the same with the next three names, all with explanations that felt like excuses, phrases that said nothing but whispered too much. Requested reassignment, soil displacement, pre-authorization reversal. But when Thomas cross-checked these notes with the county registrar, none of the families had submitted formal requests. The signatures were missing, the approvals forged or simply blank. One name, Philip Hearse, buried in 1974, appeared twice in the logs, once in Lot 39, and then again in Lot 22, 8 days later. But there was no note explaining the move. And oddly, both records were initialed by a groundskeeper named Roland Kay, who, according to the chapel's employment records, died in 1973. Thomas sat back, the paper in his hand trembling now, the skin beneath his nails pale and dry. The further back he went, the more the handwriting changed, yet the language remained eerily similar, as if every caretaker, regardless of era, had used the same phrases, the same rhythm, the same omissions. When he reached the last entry before Eric Bell's, he froze. Dated 2005, it simply read, unidentified remains, no headstone, reinterred without marker. Lot 39, no signature, no origin, no coffin manufacturer, no records of exhumation. That entry was surrounded by water stains, not fresh, but circular and brown, like dried tears pressed into the page. Thomas reached for the final folder, a burial permit issued just last week. Eric Bell, Lot 39, the only one in the last 18 years. And already, the pattern was beginning again. The fourth time it happened, Thomas was no longer surprised. He didn't bother with the morning rituals, didn't sweep the chapel floor, or count flower orders. He went straight to Lot 39, and there it was again. A coffin from 2 days prior, the one that had held David R. Moore, age 48, teacher, father of 2, was resting above ground, untouched, the soil smooth around it. No scratches, no displaced turf. The screws in the lid as tight as the day it was sealed. But this time, Thomas brought tools. He waited until the sun had climbed high enough to push the morning chill out of his joints, then carefully loosened each bolt, his gloves wet with sweat and hesitation. When the lid creaked open, he paused, not because of fear, but because of the silence. There was nothing inside, no body, no clothes, just the white satin interior, uncreased and dry, and a name tag clipped to the inner lining, David R. Moore. That, and a faint smell, not of decay, but of something sterile, old, forgotten, like pages left too long in a drawer. Thomas stepped back, blinking at the light. The death certificate had been filed. The viewing had happened. People had wept beside this very box. But the man was gone. And this wasn't the first time. He returned to the chapel and reopened the older reports. 2 more incidents had been quietly documented. In 1988, a mortician had reported a coffin disturbed by water seepage, and had found the body missing. In 1995, a groundskeeper had allegedly opened a box for a late transfer and found nothing but the funeral suit, folded and untouched, resting in the center. No official investigation was ever launched. No family had been told. The paperwork had continued. The death persisted on record, but Thomas could no longer deny it. The earth beneath Lot 39 did not keep what was given to it. It returned the coffins, yes, but it never returned what mattered. That night, unable to sleep, Thomas called the crematorium. He asked about alternatives for future burials. The man on the other end chuckled and said, "Long as it's not Lot 39. Thomas froze. "Why?" he asked. The man paused, then said, "My grandfather worked that cemetery. Told me to never trust ground that gives back." When Thomas hung up, he went back outside. The coffin was still there, gleaming under the moonlight like it had never left the showroom floor. But he noticed something new, faint indentations in the grass leading from the grave to the chapel door, as if someone or something had walked it home. Thomas knew it wasn't procedure, knew it was, at best, foolish, at worst, a violation of the sacred. But Lot 39 had long ceased to be sacred. It was a slot of dirt that played by rules no man wrote, no priest blessed. So when the next burial came, a woman, age 72, lung failure, embalmed just that morning, Thomas acted. He waited until the viewing ended, and the family left with swollen eyes and hands too quiet. When the chapel emptied, he slipped inside the preparation room, opened the casket again, and tucked a note beneath the lining, just above the woman's clasped hands. Not long, just a few words. "If you're still here, tell me how to leave." He sealed the lid himself, rode in the hearse, helped lower her into the ground, and shoveled the first layer of dirt with his own hands. He barely slept that night. When he woke the next morning, cold air leaking through the window, he knew before he looked. The coffin was back, on the grass, perfectly intact, and heavier than before. Thomas braced himself, pried open the lid, and froze. The woman was gone. Again, no clothing, no body, only the indentation where she once lay, and a letter, not his. A different paper, a different ink, a different hand, folded twice, sealed with a brittle stain that looked uncomfortably like dry blood. Inside, the message was handwritten in elegant cursive, old-fashioned and deliberate. "It's not about leaving. It's about not entering. No name, no date, just that. And underneath, as if added in haste, this ground does not consume. It returns what cannot belong." Thomas held the letter with gloves, but still felt his fingertips tremble. The words didn't scare him, not yet. What unsettled him most was the smell. Not death, not wood, but salt, like ocean wind. He looked up, and for the first time, realized that the grass around Lot 39 was greener than anywhere else in the cemetery. Lusher, damp even on dry days, as if fed from something below. He took the letter back to the chapel and locked it inside his drawer, but when he returned an hour later, it was gone. Only a single word remained, scratched into the wood at the drawer's base. Soon. That night, he moved the remaining coffins to a different part of the grounds. He avoided the lot, avoided looking at the patch of grass that gave and gave. But he knew it wasn't finished. Something was watching, not from above, but from beneath, and it had started answering back. Thomas hadn't intended to sleep there. He brought the folding chair and the thermos only to keep watch, to see if something, anything, would move in the dark. But sleep came like fog, not sudden but slow, creeping over the edges of his thoughts until the chill of midnight no longer bit through his coat. He had parked himself just beside Lot 39, flashlight angled toward the grass that never browned, that drank rain even when the sky was dry. The last thing he remembered was the moon, fractured behind bare branches, and the steady rhythm of crickets refusing to sing near that soil. When he opened his eyes again, it was dawn. Soft light spilled over the hill, turning tombstones gold and birdsong thick in the air. But something was wrong. The chair was gone. So was the flashlight. And he wasn't sitting anymore. He was lying down, on his back, on something hard. When he sat up, the chill that swept through his spine had nothing to do with the morning cold. Beneath him was a coffin, closed, resting on the surface of Lot 39, not buried, not scratched, the same model as before. But this time, it bore a tag, a fresh laminated mortuary label, and on it, his name, Thomas Elroy, date of death. That very morning, he staggered back, breath caught in his throat, but he didn't scream, didn't run. He looked around, half expecting to see someone watching, some prankster or shadowy figure lingering by the trees. But there was no one, only graves, only silence. He touched his chest, still warm. His pulse still thudded in his ears. But when he reached into his coat pocket for his phone, the screen wouldn't turn on. Not cracked, just black, and cold, like it had been left in a freezer overnight. He sprinted home, boots tearing across the dewy grass, heartbeat louder than his footsteps. But at home, the mirrors didn't recognize him. His reflection was faint, like looking at a photo halfway erased. And his cat, old, blind in one eye, hissed and ran when he opened the door. In the bathroom, he splashed water on his face. It ran down like syrup, heavy, and he noticed the calendar on the wall. The date was circled in red, not by him, and next to it, scrawled in handwriting not his own, "Don't dig again." That night, he returned to the cemetery. Lot 39 sat as always, undisturbed, as if no one had ever touched it. The coffin was gone, but the grass bore a single indentation. His name no longer appeared on any employee record, not in the logbooks, not on the roster. When he went to unlock the chapel, his key didn't fit, and inside, the younger groundskeeper stared at him through the window like he was a stranger. That was when Thomas finally understood. The plot didn't reject the dead, it rejected the idea of dying. And now that he had been chosen by it, he belonged neither above nor below. Story 5. A cemetery had its own rhythm, its own odd calendar marked not by seasons, but by the subtle shifting of things left behind. As caretaker, I'd grown used to finding wilted bouquets, faded ribbons, plastic angels toppled by wind. But there was one grave in the northeast corner just behind a row of crooked cedars that never received any visitors. Or so I thought. The stone itself was nearly illegible, the name worn to a faint smear of letters, the dates erased by rain and time. Most days, I barely noticed it at all. But one morning in late winter, as I made my rounds through the thin frost, I stopped short. There on the grave was a fresh bouquet of wildflowers, deep blue cornflowers, a few red poppies, and sprigs of yarrow bound by green thread. They were perfect, as if just cut, dew still clinging to the petals, even though the night had been dry as bone. I knelt down, half expecting the smell of rot or the telltale droop of shop-bought stems. But the flowers were alive, vibrant, almost humming in the cold air. I looked for footprints, disturbed earth, any sign of passage, but the ground was undisturbed, smooth except for my own prints leading up from the main path. I checked the schedule, the logs, asked around. None of the families with recent burials claimed responsibility. No one in town was missing flowers from their garden, and the nearest market didn't stock any of these varieties in February. Still, the next day and the day after that, more bouquets appeared, always different, always fresh. Rain didn't spoil them, frost didn't blacken their leaves. Even during the worst drought, when the grass curled and died, those flowers stood upright, defying the sun. I asked the night watchman if he'd seen anyone. He shook his head and laughed. "Maybe you've got a ghost florist," he said, but his voice didn't carry much humor. I checked the logs for the grave itself, flipping through brittle yellowed pages in the records room. The entry was so faded it could have been written in smoke. The name, if there was one, had vanished. Only the plot number remained, circled in shaky pen. No date of birth, no next of kin, No details. Just an old address for a house that had burned down in the 1970s. Nothing left but the foundation and a mailbox half sunk in the earth. It became a ritual for me, pausing every morning at that grave to see what had arrived in the night. Some days there was a cluster of violets, other times white lily or a handful of autumn leaves arranged in a spiral. Always arranged with care, always with the same green thread. The regularity of it began to gnaw at me. The cemetery wasn't a place for routine. Even the dead arrived on their own unpredictable schedule. Yet here, every sunrise, something impossible waited for me, silent proof that someone or something still remembered what the world had chosen to forget. By the end of the third week, I started to dread finding the flowers, but I dreaded not finding them even more. The stone remained blank, unclaimed, but the bouquets never stopped. It was as if the grave wanted me to notice, to ask who could possibly care for a name that no one could read. By the end of the fourth week, curiosity took over my routine, pushing sleep further away each night. The impossibility of the flowers, their presence, their persistence, felt like a challenge, or maybe a message written in petals rather than words. I began to wonder not just who was leaving them, but how. The cemetery had 2 gates, but only the heavy iron one at the main entrance was ever used. Its hinges groaned, its old lock screeched when turned. I started checking it first thing every morning, running my hand along the ironwork, brushing away any dust or spiderwebs in hopes of finding even a hint of intrusion. Yet every time, the padlock was still in place. No scratches, no sign of tampering. The ground beneath was undisturbed, the gravel resting in the same scattered pattern as the day before. It was then I remembered the old security cameras, ancient, black and white models, rigged up years ago, more for show than security. Most nights, they simply recorded empty silence and the rare movement of a stray cat or a gust of wind. But now I checked them obsessively, scrolling frame by frame, scanning for shadows. Then, early one Thursday, I found something. At 3:17 a.m., the camera that pointed at the gate flickered. The lock slipped open. The heavy gate creaked inward exactly 2 feet and then froze, hanging half open for nearly 3 minutes. There was no figure, no outline of a hand, no movement save for the iron swinging inward. Then, as the clock struck 3:20, the gate eased shut and the lock snapped back into place. I replayed the footage a dozen times. No cars, no headlights, not even the shifting blur on the camera, trying to adjust to darkness. Just the gate opening itself, closing itself, with the same inexorable patience as the rising sun. I checked the gravel at dawn, no footprints, no tire marks, not even the odd divot from a deer or stray dog. The only thing out of place was the bouquet, waiting as always on the grave. Even the dew on the petals looked undisturbed. The next night, I set the cameras to record continuously, not just on motion. I placed a handful of flour at the entrance and sprinkled it on the path between the gate and the nameless grave. I even left a glass bead on the lock, hoping it might fall if someone so much as touched the chain. In the morning, nothing had changed. The flower was undisturbed. The bead was exactly where I'd left it. The gate, however, had been opened and closed again between 3:17 and 3:18, just as before. And there, at the heart of the grave, was a perfect new bouquet of peonies and thyme, tied with green thread. I tried to laugh, but it sounded hollow. Each day the mystery grew heavier, pressing on my chest with every breath. Whatever was visiting, it left no trace but beauty, no proof but the impossible. And somehow, that was far more frightening than footprints or broken locks could ever be. It wasn't long before word spread among the staff. A couple of the younger groundskeepers began to place bets, each with their own theory. A secret admirer, a clever prankster, some night-blooming vandal who knew how to slip past even the best locks and eyes. I heard their jokes in the tool shed, but none dared linger near the grave after sunset, and none were willing to stake a night on their suspicions. Except for Will. He was new, a wiry kid from Duluth with more bravado than sense and a head full of ghost stories. "I'll catch them for you," he said, grinning as he zipped his windbreaker and pocketed his phone. He chose the Friday closest to the new moon, posted himself on a bench just inside the main gate, hidden in shadow, but with a perfect view of the path and the old grave. He texted me at 2:55, joking about the cold and his dwindling patience. By 3:15, the text stopped. I arrived early that morning, as the sun still struggled behind the trees. The gate was half open, swaying as if nudged by a gentle hand. The new bouquet was already in place violets and wild roses this time, their perfume unmistakable. I found Will sprawled on the ground beside the bench, his phone crushed beneath him, battery drained. He was breathing, pulse strong, but he wouldn't wake for nearly half an hour. When he did, he blinked at me, face pale and eyes wide, and said he'd only meant to rest his head for a moment. No memory of what happened, just a strange ringing in his ears and the impression of being watched, not by eyes, but by something cold and vast, like the wind that circles the earth. I replayed the security footage. The pattern was the same. At 3:17, the gate swung open and shut with no one visible on the screen. Will's body slumped sideways, as if pressed gently down, not shoved or struck. No shadow, no figure, not even the tremor of air disturbed by a passing presence. That evening, Will handed in his notice. He left town by the end of the week, saying nothing, leaving his keys and badge on my desk. The rest of the crew stopped making jokes. The grave became a spot everyone avoided, and for the first time, I realized I might be alone in my fascination or my fear. Still, every morning, the flowers appeared, fresh and bright against the mossy stone, untouched by frost or hand or memory. Whatever came at 3:17, whatever moved through the locked gates and left gifts for a forgotten dead, seemed to have no interest in being seen. And those who tried to look, no matter how brave, were met with nothing but darkness and the silent certainty of having been visited by something that did not wish to be witnessed. After Will left, the unease settled in like a second skin, prickling at my neck every time I passed the old section. I tried to tell myself it was all explainable. Wind, timing, some trick of the cameras or the mind. But the more the routine repeated, gate opening, flowers left, no sign of a visitor, the less plausible anything felt. I needed answers. With nothing left but paperwork to anchor me, I went deep into the records room beneath the chapel, among shelves lined with brittle folders and curling, yellowed maps. The cemetery's original survey was there, dates and lines drawn in pencil, lots numbered, pathways neatly mapped. But as I traced my finger across the northeast corner, my heart skipped. There was no grave marked in the spot where the flowers appeared. No plot, no record of purchase or burial, not in the map from 1952, nor the edition scribbled over in the 70s. Even when the city expanded the grounds, the circle of cedars had been left untouched, as if nothing was meant to be there at all. I pulled out the burial ledgers, cross-referencing the plot number from my old notes. There was a gap, an empty space in the logbooks, where every other grave had a date, a name, a family, a fee. Page after page, that plot was blank, skipped over, left as a silent pause in the cemetery's memory. I called City Hall, asked for any building permits or orders tied to that corner. They transferred me to an old clerk who remembered, after some hesitation, a story about a former caretaker in the 1960s, a man named Donald Crane. She said he'd authorized a single unmarked burial, by handwritten note, after a storm one winter, but the paperwork had gone missing. It was supposed to be temporary, she said, lowering her voice. But no one ever exhumed the body. No one ever came back for it. The city's digital files had nothing. The microfiche at the library returned only headlines about a caretaker's sudden disappearance and a small, unfollowed-up obituary for a person unidentified, no kin. The original burial record, if it ever existed, was gone. The realization grew inside me. This grave wasn't just abandoned. It was never meant to be remembered at all. Maybe that was why the flowers came, not as a comfort, but as a warning or a quiet claim of space. An apology written in stems for a wrong no one could fix. In the following days, I noticed other oddities. Tools left near the grave would go missing, only to reappear cleaned and stacked by the shed. My own notes about the plot, scribbled in my pocket notebook, faded until the ink looked decades old. Each morning, the bouquets persisted. Each night, the cameras captured only the gate opening, nothing more. The grave felt like a gap in the world's memory, a blankness stitched into the pattern of the living and the dead. I wondered, more and more, if someone or something wanted it that way. It was desperation, not logic, that led me to reach out to Greg, an old friend who ran a private security outfit in town and was known for fixing broken electronics and, when pressed, helping neighbors investigate petty thefts. I asked him, almost as a joke, if he'd ever seen footage that didn't line up with reality gates opening on their own, things moving that shouldn't. Instead of laughing, he listened, nodded, and offered to set up an extra camera on the telephone pole across the street. Its lens trained on the cemetery entrance from a safe distance. We synced watches, compared notes, and waited. That night, at exactly 3:17 a.m., Greg called me, voice trembling, clipped by static. "You need to see this," he said. The next morning, he brought the SD card over, hands shaking. We watched the footage together, the living room filled with a hush that felt colder than the frost outside. On the grainy black and white video, the iron gate appeared, inert as always until precisely on time. It swung wide with the slow, deliberate motion I'd grown to dread. For the first second, nothing moved. But then, just outside the reach of the security light, a figure materialized, human-shaped, tall, but featureless, a void against the mist. In one hand, it held a small cluster of flowers. Its presence felt impossible, the way a shadow sometimes seems to move without a body. It hovered there, facing the gate, unmoving. Then, as if aware of being watched, it turned not toward the camera, but toward the grave deep within the trees. Its head cocked, pausing. I shivered. And then the figure vanished, dissolving into the night air before ever crossing the threshold. Greg tried to pull a still image from the video, but as soon as he brought the laptop onto the cemetery grounds and loaded the file, the figure glitched, pixelated, and disappeared from the frame. He rewound, pressed play, but all that showed was the empty gate swinging, empty gravel, no sign of the visitor at all. We tried again in the office by the front drive, same result. But back at his house, in his cluttered den surrounded by trophies and half-finished gadgets, the figure reappeared. It was as if whatever crossed the threshold could not be seen or remembered from within the walls of the cemetery itself. That night, for the first time, 2 bouquets lay on the nameless grave. One was the usual arrangement of wildflowers, bound in green thread, petals glistening in the morning haze. The other was identical, but tied in a ribbon I recognized from my own desk drawer. When I bent down, a chill swept through me, almost a sense of being acknowledged or chosen. The second bouquet was meant for me, and in that instant, I understood. Some memories do not want to be witnessed, but they are patient. They wait for the right person to notice, and when you do, you become part of the vigil. You become another secret that will never quite leave. Another name in the long line of those who tend to what no one else dares to remember. Story 6. In the slow light of an ordinary Tuesday, I found myself standing before the old desk in my office, eyes stuck on the single most trusted artifact. I owned a book of burials, thick as a family Bible, its leather scuffed from generations of hands, its corners worn round as river stones. I had closed it the night before, sure as ever, and left it exactly where I always did, centered, locked away in my desk drawer, the key tucked under a loose floorboard that only I knew. That morning, though, the drawer gaped open, as if pried by an impatient hand. The book was sitting on the desktop, splayed open to a page I didn't remember marking. Across the center, in dark, perfect script, was a new name. Marvin T. Alden, the ink declared, neat and formal, followed by a date from 2 days before a day, when I knew for certain no one had come to rest beneath my care. At first, I thought it was a prank. Maybe one of the new groundskeepers fresh from the city, always looking for ways to shake the nerves of an old-timer, had slipped in, copied my handwriting, and left the entry for a laugh. But the handwriting wasn't mine. The loops were longer, the tails too precise, the M with a sharpness I'd never managed, even in my best school penmanship. I scanned the rest of the page. The ink shimmered, still almost wet, but there were no smudges, no fingerprints, nothing but the faint scent of old paper, and just barely something like iron or rain. The name nagged at me all day. I checked the local obituaries, called the funeral homes, even scanned the hospital releases. No Marvin Alden, no deaths matching the date, no family asking for plots or headstones. When sunset fell, I did my rounds out of habit, boots crunching over last year's leaves, wind picking at the moss between the stones. The west section of the cemetery was the newest, a slow-growing grid of gray granite that always felt less settled, as if the land itself still objected to being filled. That's where I saw it, a fresh headstone just off the main path, too new to be stained or chipped, its letters gleaming pale in the dusk. Marvin T. Alden, 1957 to 2023. Beneath the name, a line I didn't order, here and only here remembered. The earth was perfectly tamped, grass trimmed, as if the grave had been tended for weeks. I ran my hand over the polished face, half expecting to feel paint or stickers, but the engraving was flawless, cut deep and true. I checked my logbook, no orders, no payment, no requests. Nobody in town could tell me who Marvin was. Not a single person in our county had any connection to the name. For the first time in all my years as caretaker, I locked the office door behind me that night and took the book home. I couldn't shake the sense that the west section had grown colder, that the stones watched when I walked away. Lying awake, I tried to tell myself it was a simple mistake, a prank, a fluke of administration. But all I could see in my mind was that name, penned by no living hand, calling something new into being beneath the dark soil I was meant to keep in order. And somehow, I knew the book wasn't finished with me yet. After that first night, I kept the book within arm's reach, moving it from my truck to the desk, sometimes setting it on the nightstand, just to keep its strange presence under my watchful eye. For 3 days, nothing changed. I checked the west section each morning, half afraid and half hopeful that Marvin's headstone would disappear as inexplicably as it had come. But it stayed solid, undeniable, as real as any other grave in that patch of ground. When I mentioned the name to townsfolk, the same puzzled looks greeted me. No one had a relative by that name, no distant cousin, no friend of a friend who'd gone missing. The cemetery, for all its weight of years, had never felt as secretive as it did in those days. But then the book changed again. One morning, before dawn, I found it open, though I was sure I'd closed it tight the night before. Now, another name appeared, written with that same careful, unhurried script. Clara Denise Hall, July 23, 2023. This time, the date was 4 days in the future. My hands trembled a little as I ran a finger beneath the new line, feeling the slightest indent, where the ink had pressed fresh into the page, almost as if the pen was still moving in memory. A cold unease crept over me. I checked the phone book and city records. No Clara Hall in our county, but that did nothing to settle me. I felt like I'd been drafted into some private game, its rules hidden from everyone but the book. Days passed in slow, watchful fear. I checked the west section hourly. At midnight on the appointed day, I walked the rows with a flashlight, determined to catch any vandal, or whatever passed for one, before they could plant a headstone. But there was nothing, just the hush of wind through dry grass, the creak of branches above. I slept badly that night, but in the gray haze of dawn, as the crows began to stir, I walked out again and felt my breath hitch in my chest. There, Not 10 feet from Marvin Holden's stone was a new marker. Clara Denise Hall, 1965 to 2023. Same phrase beneath. Here, and only here. Remembered. The earth looked freshly packed, but there was no sign anyone had worked the soil. No boot prints, no wheelbarrow marks, nothing but the glistening dew on unbroken grass. That day, my anxiety slipped over into obsession. I turned the pages in the logbook, scanning for more names, and they began to appear slowly, like stains in the margins. Paul R. Vinnick, Samantha Liu, Francis O'Hara, all with dates a few days or a week out, never more. Always a sense of inevitability. My stomach twisted every time I saw a new entry. I called the police chief, who kindly listened and told me to maybe take a little break from work. But the city still needed someone to look after its dead. I tried to warn a neighbor her name appeared one evening, Margaret Willis, July 28, 2023, but she was gone the next day, her family in shock, found in her garden with nothing but a heart stopped cold. Her headstone was already there that morning when I checked, set deep and clean in the west section, name and dates matching exactly. None of her family recalled asking for a plot or stone. My own hands started to tremble every time I flipped the logbook open, knowing I would find more names, knowing the pattern was always the same. The future, it seemed, was being written ahead of me, and with every new entry, the cemetery grew a little colder, a little more crowded, while the town above remained unaware that something below was writing its own ledger of the dead. It was Margaret Willis's funeral that finally broke my composure. I stood among her family, the preacher murmuring prayers while the wind whipped at the edge of the west section, but my mind wasn't on scripture or comfort. I couldn't stop staring at the stone, so recently set and yet already weathered, as if time moved differently around these new graves. That night, after everyone left and dusk curled its cold fingers across the grounds, I locked myself in the office and set the book before me, determined to fight back against whatever spell had settled over my cemetery. I flipped to the latest entry, Francis O'Hara, dated 2 days ahead, and with trembling hands, I tried to tear the page from the book. The paper resisted. At first, I thought it was just old and thick, but the more I pulled, the more it stretched and thinned without breaking, the ink swimming across the fibers like water spilled on a painting. When at last I managed to separate the sheet, I let out a shaky breath, feeling both relieved and foolish. But as I tossed the torn page into the trash, a strange unease prickled at the back of my neck. I turned back to the book, hoping to see a blank space, a victory, however small. Instead, the next page shimmered faintly, and as I watched in horror, the missing entry wrote itself a new Francis O'Hara, same date, but now accompanied by a second entry, Francis O'Hara, July 30th, 2023, 2 stones for the same name. The ink bled along the crease, duplicating itself, as if my attempt to alter the book had only encouraged it to multiply. I tried everything scribbling over the words, blacking them out with thick marker, even burning a corner of the paper with a lighter. But every morning, the book reappeared whole, pristine, the names exactly as before, sometimes even multiplied, as if my resistance was nothing more than an invitation for escalation. The next day, the west section of the cemetery grew again, now with not 1, but 2 new markers for Francis O'Hara, each engraved with the same phrase, "Here and only here, remembered." I tried to take photographs to show the sheriff or the city clerk, but every image came out blurred, the stones seeming to slide from view or appear cracked and incomplete. I began to see a pattern. Every act of interference, every denial, only accelerated the process. The book was not just a passive record, it was feeding, drawing from my defiance a new energy. The west section swelled with anonymous stones, their inscriptions matching names that had never been mentioned in our town, as if the book had a supply of souls to draw from, inventing the dead to fill its pages. And at night, when the wind howled and the office felt impossibly small, I would sometimes hear the soft sound of pages turning, even though the book lay closed and heavy on my desk. as if it was reading itself, writing new stories, preparing the ground for what was to come. The sense of dread grew sharper. The anonymous graves were no longer just a mystery. They were becoming a warning. The more I tried to erase the names, the more I felt my own presence thinning at the edges. As if with every new grave, the book was drawing closer to me. By August, sleep had become a distant memory. The book never stayed closed. No matter where I hid it locked in the safe, tucked beneath floorboards, left inside the glove box of my old Chevy, it would always be waiting for me the next morning. Open on my desk, the ink glistening like it had just been set by candlelight. I started each day with the same ritual. Scan the names, check the dates, pray. I didn't recognize anyone newly listed. But dread was a poor shield, and one morning I froze, coffee cup halfway to my lips, as my eyes caught a fresh entry in the familiar, inhuman hand. Samuel D. Ellison, August 15th, 2023. My own name, my birthday even. I felt my heart shudder. Beneath the name, the script was tighter, almost rushed, as if the pen had pressed harder. Caretaker, here and only here, remembered. It was as if a lock had snapped shut inside me. My hands shook so badly, I nearly dropped the cup. I tried to scratch out the entry, but every pass of the pen only spread the ink. My name multiplying along the page, seeping into the margins, creeping over the leather inside cover, and, to my mounting horror, even onto the table beneath, black stains curling into the grain, like roots reaching for water. I rushed to the phone and dialed my sister in Duluth, desperate for any distraction. But when she answered, she said my voice sounded faint, like I was calling from underwater. "Are you all right?" she asked. I wanted to tell her everything, but the words evaporated, replaced by a static silence that pressed cold against my skull. I went out to the west section, hoping to prove to myself it was all just a nightmare, a symptom of exhaustion, or a mind warped by too many nights among the stones. But there, already in place among the others, was a blank headstone, the marble unnaturally pale in the weak morning light. As I drew closer, my footsteps slowed. Carved into its surface was my name, crisp and recent, with the date set for 3 days ahead. The phrase beneath was the same, here and only here, remembered. I reached out to touch the stone, half expecting my hand to pass through it, but it was solid, icy, humming faintly with a vibration I felt in my bones. The town carried on, oblivious. I tried to call the city office, but the line dropped each time I said my own name. I attempted to send an email. Every letter I typed faded before I could hit send, the cursor blinking in an empty box. Even when I wrote my name by hand on a post-it note, the ink would bead up and run, leaving nothing but a smudge. At the grocery store, my signature at the register vanished from the receipt before the cashier could tear it off. My sense of self grew unsteady, my edges blurred. It was as if the book was erasing me in stages, rehearsing the script of my departure one line at a time, making sure nothing would remain once the appointed date arrived. And yet, every night, I'd find the book on my pillow or on the kitchen counter, my name written larger, darker, the finality in its looping letters impossible to ignore. The cemetery, my world for 3 decades, no longer felt like my domain. It was the books now. It was the West sections. All I could do was wait and watch as my existence became just another entry in a record that seemed determined to outlast the living, devouring the keeper as easily as any other name. The day before my name's appointed date, the world seemed to slow, light dulling at the edges, the air in the cemetery thick as syrup. I avoided the west section, but it called to me in the periphery, its new stones standing just out of view, as if the rows rearranged themselves when I wasn't looking. At dawn, I found the burial record book closed tight on my desk, heavier than it had ever felt, as if all its ink and secrets weighed down the leather. I didn't want to open it, but my hands acted on their own, peeling back the cover to the last blank page. I watched, breath caught, as the pen lying untouched beside it rose an inch and, with a faint scratch, began to move across the paper in that same careful script. My name, one final time, with tomorrow's date. No embellishments, no flourish. The ink bled outward, soaking into the very edges of the paper, as if the book itself was running out of room for what came next. I rushed for the door, the urge to escape overwhelming, but the office lock, which had never caught before, was jammed. My keys rattled in the lock to no avail. I pounded on the old wood, shouting until my throat was raw, but no one passed, no one heard. When I turned back, the book had closed itself and sat upright, spine straight, as if waiting for a librarian's hand. Through the office window, I could just glimpse the west section. The headstones there seemed closer now, encroaching toward the building, the grass between them dark and matted as fur. My phone was dead, no signal, no power, the screen black as a sealed grave. I tried to write a note, to record my voice, to leave behind any proof I'd existed outside the book's record, but every word unraveled before I could finish. My reflection in the glass blurred, details slipping away until I seemed little more than a smudge with eyes. Outside, the sky thickened, gray with a haze that wasn't fog or smoke, but something heavier, settling over the cemetery like a lid. Sometime after midnight, I heard movement outside the office, a shuffle on the gravel path. The sense of dread pressed so hard against my chest, I could hardly breathe. Footsteps stopped at the threshold, a pause. The handle jiggled, then stilled. From the book, a slow, dragging sound, the last page turning on its own, a soft whisper like the closing of a door. I understood then that the book wasn't just a record, it was a key, and the west section wasn't a field of graves, but a ledger's final line. As dawn crept in, the office door at last swung open. I staggered outside, numb, half hoping the world would return to normal, that I'd simply been lost in a night terror. But in the west section, a new headstone gleamed. My name, today's date, the phrase beneath, here and only here, remembered. The earth around it looked freshly turned, the grass damp and black. The book of records was gone from my hands, its memory etched only in the faintest ache behind my eyes. And as I reached out to touch the stone, I felt my own name fade from memory, slipping away with the morning mist, leaving only silence and the certainty that the cemetery would remember me longer than anyone else ever could. Story 7. It started with a box of forgotten junk. They were repairing a leak in the roof of St. Agnes Chapel, one of those old wooden churches at the far edge of town, and the contractor's assistant came up from the basement carrying an ornate, dust-choked mirror, the glass wavy and the frame blackened with age. "You want this?" he'd asked, half joking, but there was nowhere else to put it, so one of the volunteers propped it on the back wall above the folding chairs, where the sunlight never reached. For a while, nobody noticed it. The congregation was shrinking, funerals outnumbered weddings, and most of the regulars didn't spend long in the chapel after dark. Only the grounds crew lingered, working late with their hands full of cleaning rags and polish, watching the seasons turn through the chapel's stained glass. I'd worked there since the late 90s, digging graves and locking up at night, and for a long time, the mirror was just another object in a building full of them. But a week after the mirror went up, someone finally noticed something was wrong. It was Mrs. Redman, the pastor's wife, who had brought flowers to the altar one morning and caught her reflection not showing up as she passed. She joked about it at first, but when I checked, I saw the same thing, just the far side of the graveyard in the glass. The hill where the sun came up, a row of crooked stones beneath the old willow. I waved my hand in front of the mirror, expecting to see it shimmer or ripple, but nothing changed. It simply refused to reflect me, or anyone else. A few days later, a local kid came in with his dad, poked his head into the chapel, and asked if there was a projector behind the mirror, or if it was some new trick for the annual Halloween service. It became a curiosity, a little urban legend. The choir kids would dare each other to stand in front of it after dark to see if it would finally wake up. Nothing ever did. The janitor, Mr. Evans, told me he'd spent a whole afternoon polishing the glass, but still only saw the cemetery outside, as if the mirror were a window, not a mirror at all. And yet the glass was real, cold to the touch, flecked with the grit of a century's dust, frame carved with worn-out prayers in Latin no one could read anymore. At night, after services, I'd lock the front doors and glance back at it, half hoping to catch a glimpse of myself, or even a flicker of movement that belonged to someone still alive. But it always showed the same thing: the hill, the stones, the willow, and a kind of bruised bluish sky, even when the real sky outside was pitch black. The oddest part was how the mirror's reflection never changed with the seasons or the weather. In July, when the grass outside burned gold in the sun, the mirror showed the cemetery sodden with dew, headstones shining as if it were October. In January, with snowdrifts covering every inch of ground, the mirror's cemetery was damp, muddy, the willow full of yellowing leaves. The more we looked, the more it felt as if the mirror had its own rules, its own sense of time, and none of us were included in it. Eventually, people stopped going near it altogether, not out of fear, but out of a kind of embarrassed unease, as if the mirror were politely ignoring our presence, reflecting a world that never had room for the living. After the mirror had been on the chapel wall for nearly a month, its presence shifted from curiosity to quiet discomfort, though nobody could put into words exactly why. It became a ritual for me to check it at the end of my shift, sometimes with a broom in hand, sometimes just lingering in the empty pews as dusk pressed against the stained glass. I started to notice small inconsistencies, things you only catch if you stare too long. The headstones in the mirror's world weren't quite where they should have been. A marble angel that, in reality, watched over the north corner of the cemetery, now appeared in the center, her wings spread wide in the reflected dusk. The old stone cross for the Macpherson twins, which had long ago cracked and leaned into the roots of the willow, stood upright in the mirror, moss-free, as if it had just been set in place. Sometimes a new headstone would flicker into view for a day or two, engraved with names that didn't match any burial record I'd ever seen. But most unsettling was the subtle shifting of shadow in the reflected world. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light branches swaying, clouds moving past the sun, but then I realized there was a figure at the far edge of the mirrored cemetery, always at the same spot, near a crooked headstone I didn't recognize, never walking, just standing with an impossible stillness, cloaked in a darkness deeper than the shadows cast by the real willow outside. The longer I watched, the clearer the outline became. A person, tall and thin, dressed in black from collar to shoes, face obscured. Sometimes, in the last light of day, it seemed as if their head would tilt just slightly, as if listening to something on the wind or acknowledging the presence of an audience. I mentioned it to Mr. Evans one evening as we locked up. He just shook his head and said the whole place had always felt like it belonged more to the dead than the living. "Maybe that mirror's just honest," he muttered, and left it at that. But the feeling grew. Visitors to the chapel started asking about the mirror, their voices quiet, uneasy. Some swore they could see relatives long buried, reflected in places where the real stones were worn smooth by rain. One afternoon, I found a tourist from out of state, standing for almost half an hour in front of the glass, unmoving, eyes wide and unblinking. When I gently touched her shoulder, she flinched, as if waking from a dream, and hurried away without another word. With each passing week, it became harder to shake the sense that the mirror wasn't showing us a different time or a ghostly replay, but rather a version of the cemetery where the past was never finished, where every memory, every forgotten name lingered just at the edge of vision, watched over by the silent figure in black. I tried more than once to turn the mirror to the wall, to cover it with a sheet, but every morning it was right back in place, spotless and patient, waiting for someone else to look. The weeks passed in a strange equilibrium. Most people avoided the chapel's far wall, and those who stayed too long in the presence of the mirror grew quieter, more thoughtful, even forgetful, like they were carrying a bit of that other world away with them. But there were patterns I couldn't ignore. If I swept the floor and glanced up quickly, Sometimes the arrangement of the graves behind me in the reflection didn't match what I knew by heart outside. Graves that had been covered with fallen leaves for years gleamed marble white in the mirror, freshly cleaned. Other times, flowers appeared in the glass bouquets of the kind that hadn't been popular in decades, resting atop stones. No one in town had visited since before I was born. Names would blur, letters sliding out of focus before snapping back. The whole graveyard reordering itself just beneath the surface of the glass. And always, the black-clad figure lingered on the edge, never moving, never fully turning its face. It was in one of those slow, gray afternoons, dust motes floating in the chapel's filtered light, that I watched the figure in the mirror begin to shift. At first, it was nothing more than a subtle tilt, a movement almost too small to trust, like a shadow bending with the breeze. Then, unmistakably, it leaned in, just a little, as if peering through the glass from the other side. I felt the cold crawl of dread along my arms, an instinct that told me to look away, to step back, but I couldn't. My reflection, if I even had one, remained stubbornly absent, but the mirrored cemetery grew sharper, and the figure more present, as if the boundary between their world and mine was thinning. In that moment, I heard the faintest sound, not quite a voice, and not quite the wind, but something like a sigh echoing from behind the glass. It spoke no words, just breathed, and for a split second I saw a glimmer of eyes, dark, intelligent, holding a sorrow that felt centuries old. That night, I locked the chapel early, checking and rechecking the doors. I avoided looking at the mirror, but as I turned out the lights, I caught a glimpse of the figure in the glass, now standing closer to the willow, hand resting on a headstone, as if in silent mourning. I tried to tell myself it was all stress and shadows, a mind playing tricks after years spent among the dead. Yet in my bones, I knew something had changed. The mirror was no longer content with reflecting only what was outside. It was learning to remember, to respond, and maybe soon to reveal. The next morning, as sunlight broke through the trees and painted the chapel's wooden floor with pale stripes, I found myself drawn back to the mirror, despite every rational instinct. I stood before it, broom in hand, and once more found only the reflection of the old cemetery, dew glistening on the grass, sky low and heavy, as if autumn had taken up permanent residence on the other side of the glass. The gravestones in the mirror, now familiar to me in their wrongness, were arranged in a subtle spiral I hadn't noticed before, coiling inward toward the willow. At the spiral's center stood the figure in black closer than ever, its outline crisp in the morning light, and though the face was still hidden by the brim of an old-fashioned hat, there was no mistaking the intent in its stance. It was watching and waiting. For the rest of the day, I couldn't shake the sensation that something just beyond my sight was reaching out to the world behind the glass. When visitors came to light candles or leave flowers in the chapel, I noticed they lingered near the mirror, almost magnetized by it, even if they didn't seem to realize. One elderly man, after placing a white lily on the altar, stopped in front of the mirror and began quietly reciting the names of friends he'd buried decades before. As he spoke, each name shimmered on a gravestone in the reflection, only to be swallowed up by the ground as the black-clad figure drifted past them, silent and purposeful. When the man finished, his voice trembling, he turned away, wiping his eyes with the sleeve of his jacket. "That wasn't right," he whispered to me. "The stones, they weren't supposed to move." As the day faded into dusk, I sat alone in a back pew, watching the last gold light fade from the glass. For the first time, I realized that the mirror wasn't only a window into something older and sadder than memory. It was a participant, a presence reshaping the cemetery's history each time it was observed. I wondered what would happen if I turned my back for good, refused to look anymore, left the mirror to gather dust in the silence. But then I thought of the figure at the center of the spiral, always waiting, always just a little nearer, and knew I couldn't turn away. Some burdens you don't choose. Some eyes you never stop feeling on the back of your neck. And the next time I looked, the willow in the mirror was trembling, though outside the air was still. That night, sleep was shallow and fragmented, haunted by indistinct dreams of the chapel, the willow, and the spiral of gravestones spinning in endless motion. I woke before dawn, heart pounding with the conviction that something had shifted. The sky outside my window was cloudless, the air sharp and cold, but inside, the chapel seemed to pulse with a quiet energy, as if anticipating an arrival. I hesitated at the threshold, feeling that old stubborn resistance. Don't go in, don't look, but habit and duty carried me forward. The chapel was dim, shadows deep in every corner, but the mirror gleamed as if it had captured every drop of the coming sunrise. The reflection was not empty. The spiral of headstones had coiled tighter, compressing space until the figure in black stood almost directly before the glass, only a few feet from where I stood. Its head was raised. The hat no longer shaded its face, and though its features were indistinct, washed out like old newsprint, I could sense its eyes fixed on me, studying, patient and unhurried. I reached out, compelled, the way you reach for a door you know you shouldn't open, and let my fingertips hover a breath from the glass. The air between my skin and the mirror was icy, and for a moment I saw my own outline flicker at the edge of the reflection, wavering and half-formed, swallowed almost instantly by the figure's dark presence. My name began to fade from my memory, syllable by syllable, until I could recall only the first letter. I gasped and pulled away. The figure in the mirror did not move, but a faint smile touched its blurred lips, a smile not of welcome, but of knowing. Behind it, the willow shook as if battered by invisible wind, and the gravestones around its base shuddered, their names running like ink in a rainstorm. The chapel was utterly silent, but in the hush I heard the echo of old prayers, the murmur of the forgotten dead, all circling that silent figure, circling me. I staggered back, breathless, and felt the weight of years pressing against my shoulders, the certainty that I would never be alone in this place again. Outside, the world went on as always, the morning bright and ordinary. Inside, the mirror waited, spiral tightening, history unwinding, patient for the day when someone would look just a moment too long and step inside.